Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. Today, we're going to be looking at Canada during the Cold War.
Okay.
You know, that global clash of ideologies that kind of defined the 20th century. But we're going to be looking at it through a uniquely Canadian lens.
Right.
We often view this era through an American lens.
Yeah.
But Canada's response to the Cold War was really distinct. More measured, maybe, but no less profound. And we're going to uncover some pretty fascinating events.
Okay.
A massive labor strike that was labeled a communist plot.
Oh, wow.
A Soviet defector spilling secrets. And we'll examine how these events that seem so distant actually rippled through the lives of everyday Canadians.
It's fascinating to think about how this era really forced Canadians to grapple with what it meant to be Canadian. What did loyalty look like? How much freedom were people willing to give up in the name of security? These questions really echoed through the decades, and in many ways, I think they still resonate today.
For sure. Okay, so to understand Canada's response to the Cold War, we really need to go back even further. I've heard about this Winnipeg General Strike of 1919.
Yes.
Tens of thousands of workers striking, the city practically shutting down.
Exactly. It was a pivotal moment.
Yeah.
What's really significant here is how the strike was framed.
Okay.
It wasn't just a labor dispute, right? It was a Bolshevik conspiracy, the Red Menace infiltrating Canada.
Oh, wow.
And you have to imagine, this is even before the Soviet Union really becomes a major player on the world stage.
Wow. So that deep-seated fear of communism was already there.
It was.
I remember my grandmother actually mentioning something about this once.
Oh, really?
How her parents were so worried about communist influences spreading.
It's striking how those anxieties really filtered down through generations.
Right.
And the response to the Winnipeg strike, I think, really set a precedent.
Oh, okay.
The government deployed troops, there were violent clashes, and the event was ultimately crushed. And this really cemented the idea that left-leaning movements, even those advocating for workers' rights, were inherently dangerous.
So this event casts a long shadow over how Canada would react later on when the Cold War truly takes hold.
Absolutely.
But then World War II happens and things get even more complicated.
Things get a lot more complicated.
The Soviet Union becomes an ally against Nazi Germany.
Yeah.
What a strange turn of events.
It really is. It's a strange turn of events. Indeed.
So this shift forced Canada to make some adjustments.
Good.
The Communist Party of Canada, which had essentially been outlawed, gains a little bit of legitimacy.
Yeah.
Imprisoned communist leaders are released. And in 1943, they actually formed the Labor Progressive Party, or LPP.
The LPP, that's right.
So this is where we see a key difference between Canada and the U.S.
Yes.
While the U.S. was cracking down hard on communists, even suspected ones, Canada initially takes a much more moderate approach. Was this moderation truly rooted in Canadian values, or was it more about strategic necessity at that point in time?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
It gets at the heart of how Canadian identity was evolving during this time.
Right.
The LPP was allowed to participate in elections, to have a voice, which is a stark contrast to the McCarthyist witch hunts that were happening just south of the border.
Right.
But this balancing act, it wouldn't last forever.
This is where that Soviet defector comes in?
Yes.
The Gouzenko Affair? That's the kind of story you would see in a spy movie.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
In 1945, a Soviet cipher clerk named Igor Gouzenko defected to Canadian authorities. Now, a cipher clerk is someone who encodes and decodes messages. So he had access to highly sensitive information. And what he revealed sent shockwaves through the Canadian government. Evidence of a Soviet spy ring operating within Canada.
So this must have been a turning point for Canada.
It was
confirming all those deep-seated fears about communist infiltration.
Right.
How did ordinary Canadians react to this? Was there a sense of panic?
Oh, you can imagine the headlines, the sense of betrayal, the questions about who could be trusted.
Wow.
The Gouzenko affair really made the threat feel so real, so immediate.
Yeah.
And it had a profound impact on Canada's domestic policies. This is where things start to shift, moving away from that initial moderation.
So how did this shift manifest itself? What kind of policies did Canada implement?
Well, they expanded anti-communist screening programs, targeting individuals suspected of communist sympathies.
Okay.
Now, these weren't quite the same as the sweeping McCarthyist purges that were happening in the U.S., but they were significant. Even sailors working on the Great Lakes were subjected to these screenings. It really shows how deeply this fear permeated Canadian society. And it's important to note that Canada's response, was still more measured than what was happening in the U.S. But the Gouzenko Affair undoubtedly marked a turning point. Yeah.
It really raises these questions about how this event impacted Canadian identity and this balance between security and individual liberties.
It makes me wonder how artists and cultural figures responded to this atmosphere of suspicion and fear.
Yeah.
Was there a sense of self-censorship, or did they push back against these anxieties?
That's a really great question, and one that historians are still kind of exploring today.
Right.
There's certainly evidence of both.
Okay.
Some artists and writers definitely felt pressured to conform, to avoid themes or expressions that might be deemed subversive or dangerous.
Right.
But others really used their art to challenge the prevailing narrative.
Oh, wow.
To critique the excesses of anti-communism and to really explore the complexities of Canadian identity during this really turbulent era.
So even in the midst of all this Cold War tension, there were pockets of resistance, alternative voices, challenging the kind of dominant narrative.
Absolutely.
It makes you think about how art can be a powerful tool.
For dissent, for questioning authority, and for really exploring those uncomfortable truths.
Absolutely. And it's important to remember that the Cold War wasn't just a geopolitical struggle, right? It was also a cultural battleground.
Oh, yeah.
Ideas, values, and beliefs were constantly being contested and reshaped.
This brings us back to the fate of the Labour Progressive Party.
Yes.
You mentioned that they were allowed to exist, to participate in elections.
Right.
But after Gouzenko, things must have become much more difficult for them.
Yeah, after the Gouzenko Affair, things definitely became much more difficult for the LPP.
Right.
They were constantly being accused of being a front for Moscow, of being a threat to Canadian security.
Right.
It became increasingly difficult for them to operate in that kind of climate.
I can imagine it created a chilling effect.
Yeah.
Did people who held left-leaning views, even if they weren't members of the LPP, feel pressured to stay silent?
Absolutely. The fear of being labeled a communist sympathizer was very real. People lost their jobs, their reputations, even their families because of their political beliefs or their associations.
It's a stark reminder of how fear and suspicion can erode democratic values.
Right.
Even in a country like Canada, with its strong traditions of tolerance and freedom of expression.
Yeah.
Did this chilling effect extend beyond politics? Did it impact other aspects of Canadian society?
Yes. It seeped into various areas of life.
Okay.
Universities, for example, became sites of scrutiny.
Oh, really?
With professors and students being monitored for any signs of communist leanings.
Oh.
Even the arts and entertainment industry was impacted,
right,
with some individuals being blacklisted or facing pressure to conform to that prevailing anti-communist sentiment.
So the Gouzenko Affair triggered a kind of cultural paranoia.
It did.
Shaping everything from politics to education to the arts. It's fascinating
and
a little unsettling to think about how this one event could have such a wide-ranging impact.
Right.
What about the economic ramifications? Did the Cold War anxieties affect Canada's economic policies in any way?
Yeah, the Cold War had a significant impact on Canada's economic development.
Okay.
The government invested heavily in defense industries, aligning its economy more closely with that of the United States. There was also a big focus on promoting capitalist values and encouraging private enterprise, partly as a way to counter the perceived threat of communist economic models.
So the Cold War wasn't just about military and ideological competition.
Right.
It was also about shaping global economic systems and trade patterns.
It was.
It makes you wonder how much of Canada's current economic landscape can actually be traced back to those Cold War anxieties.
That's a question that I think economists and historians are still debating.
Yeah.
It's clear that the Cold War had a lasting impact. but it's difficult to completely disentangle it from all the other factors that were also shaping Canada's economy at the time.
It's like trying to unravel a tangled thread, seeing how all these different forces intertwined and influenced each other.
Right.
But even though the LPP disbanded in 1959, you mentioned that the stigma around leftist politics still lingered.
Yes.
What were the long-term consequences of that?
Well, even though the Communist Party was never actually outlawed in Canada,
Right.
the association with communism became a real political liability.
Yeah.
It took decades for left-leaning political movements to kind of shed that stigma and gain mainstream acceptance.
So it's not just about one political party disappearing.
Yeah.
It's about a whole spectrum of political thought being marginalized.
Yeah.
Pushed to the fringes of acceptable discourse.
Right.
How did this impact Canadian society? Did it create a more conservative political landscape?
That's a complex question.
Yeah.
And there's no simple answer.
Right.
But it's certainly true that the Cold War contributed to a climate of caution.
Okay.
A reluctance to embrace radical ideas or challenge the status quo.
It seems like this fear, this suspicion, had a ripple effect that extended far beyond the immediate threat of communist infiltration.
It did.
It shaped political discourse, social attitudes, even cultural expression.
Absolutely. And it's important to remember that these anxieties weren't evenly distributed.
Right.
They often manifested in discriminatory ways, targeting specific communities based on their ethnicity, their political beliefs, or even their sexual orientation.
Like those Cold War anxieties were layered on top of existing prejudices and inequalities,
right,
amplifying them in ways that were often very subtle but deeply damaging.
Yeah.
Were there any particular communities that were disproportionately impacted by this?
Yes. Several groups faced heightened scrutiny and suspicion during this era.
Okay.
For example, immigrants from Eastern Europe,
Right.
particularly those with ties to socialist or communist movements, were often viewed with a lot of distrust.
Yeah.
Their loyalty questioned simply because of their origin.
It's tragic to think about how individuals were judged and marginalized not for their actions, but for their perceived beliefs or affiliations.
Yeah.
It seems like the very notion of what it meant to be Canadian was being redefined in this climate of fear and suspicion.
Absolutely. The Cold War really forced Canadians to confront the question of who belonged.
Yeah.
Who was considered a true Canadian and who was seen as an outsider,
Right.
a potential threat.
So it wasn't just about external threats.
It wasn't.
It was about internal divisions, about drawing lines between us and them.
Exactly.
And it makes you wonder, are those lines truly erased? Do those Cold War anxieties still linger beneath the surface of Canadian society today?
That's a question that I think continues to resonate today.
Yeah.
As we delve deeper into the legacy of the Cold War, we're going to explore how those anxieties have morphed and adapted to new threats and challenges. We've talked about the Gouzenko Affair and that wave of anti-communist sentiment that followed.
Right.
But even before that, like during World War II,
Yeah.
Canada had implemented policies to intern and surveil individuals who were deemed a threat to national security.
Right. Many of those targeted were Italian and Japanese Canadians.
Yeah, that's right. A really dark chapter in Canadian history.
It is.
It's heartbreaking to think about how entire communities were so unjustly targeted, their loyalty questioned simply because of their heritage.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And these actions weren't just isolated incidents.
Right.
They were really driven by this broader climate of fear and suspicion.
Yeah.
This fear that was so easily manipulated to justify discrimination and the erosion of civil liberties.
So while we've highlighted how Canada's response to the Cold War was more measured than the U.S. in some ways, it's clear that there were still some really serious breaches of individual rights and freedoms.
Exactly. And it's crucial to acknowledge this darker side of Canada's Cold War experience.
Yeah.
To confront those uncomfortable truths.
Right.
And understand how they continue to shape our society today.
It makes you wonder how much of that Cold War mindset still persists.
Do we still see echoes of those anxieties, that suspicion of the other, in how we approach issues like terrorism or immigration today?
That's a really profound question.
Yeah.
And one that I think each of us needs to really grapple with.
For sure.
It's easy to draw parallels between the fear of communism during the Cold War and our contemporary anxieties about global terrorism, for example.
You mentioned earlier how the government expanded its surveillance programs during the Cold War.
Yes.
It makes you think about the debates we're having now about privacy and security in this digital age. Are we sacrificing too much freedom in the name of safety?
It's such a complex issue with no easy answers.
Right.
But I think it's essential to be aware of how history can repeat itself, how those anxieties about security can be exploited to justify policies that erode our fundamental rights.
It's like we're constantly trying to find that balance, right?
Yeah.
Between protecting ourselves and preserving the very values that define us as a society.
Exactly. And understanding the complexities of the Cold War, how those anxieties played out, can really help us navigate these contemporary challenges with more awareness and critical thinking.
I love that. Using history as a lens to understand the present and make more informed decisions about the future.
Absolutely. And that's the power of history, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's not just about the past. It's about understanding the present and shaping the future that we want to create.
Beautifully said.
Yeah.
Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground today.
We have.
We've explored how the Cold War, while often seen through an American lens, had a unique and lasting impact on Canada.
Yes.
It's shaped our political discourse, our social attitudes, cultural expression, economic policies, and even the very notion of what it means to be Canadian.
And as we've seen, this impact wasn't always positive. There are these dark chapters, moments where fear and suspicion led to the erosion of civil liberties and discrimination against certain communities.
It's crucial to remember that history is not just about celebrating our triumphs or lamenting our failures.
Right.
It's about learning from the past, understanding the complexities of human behavior, and using that knowledge to build a better future.
Exactly. And I hope this deep dive has encouraged you to think critically about Canada's Cold War experience, to question your assumptions, and to explore the connections between the past and the present.
Absolutely. And if you're interested in learning more about this really fascinating period in Canadian history, we encourage you to check out the resources that we mentioned in the show notes.
Yeah, there are some fantastic books, documentaries, and articles out there that can really provide a deeper understanding of this complex and consequential era.
So keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep the conversation going. Thanks for joining us on this group diving.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.